This is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast
with Tony Bruschi.
We are talking with psychotherapist Siobhan Scott today, going into the tale of Manson and one of his followers, specifically Leslie Van Houten, who has now been released from prison, once on death row, then life in prison, and now all the way to out on parole. We talked about this several weeks ago, and it looks like at this time she is going to be getting released. This obviously one of the Manson followers of the governor, Newsom, says he will not contest the release. That's been the sticking point on all the other times where she was about to be granted it. But I think it's important before we talk about whether this is just or not to remember exactly what Leslie Van Houten was charged with doing and admitted to doing August 10th, 1969, along with other members of the Manson family. Charles Tex Watson and others broke into the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Van Houten and others, following Manson's orders, part of his plan to incite a race war called Helter Skelter. Once inside the house, Watson and others tied up a couple, began attacking them. While Watson murdered Leno LaBianca, Van Houten and others took Rosemary LaBianca into the other room, stabbed Rosemary with a bayonet. He directed Van Houten to do something. Van Houten then stabbed Rosemary 16 times in the back and buttocks. They were so forceful that they literally exposed her spine. It was a horrible, horrible attack that she was involved in. Afterwards, they felt so bad about it that they sat down in their kitchen and ate watermelon. Mm-hmm. And I say that very sarcastically. This is a horrible, brutal attack. And yes, when we look at it as, was she under the influence of Manson at the time? Sure, but she was an adult as well. Mm-hmm. Even though she's 73, somebody did this. Somebody had the capacity to do this at one point in their life. Is this someone who really should ever be set free?
Yeah, I'm sure if I were a family member of the LaBiancos, I would be very upset right now. And I think a case can be made that anyone who participated in this kind of a murder should probably never walk among the rest of us again. I get it. It does, again, illustrate the danger of cults, mind control cults. And much like we saw with Lori and Chad Daybell, the bizarre belief system that makes absolutely no sense, and then the kinds of horrendous violence that people who look very normal externally can do just absolutely terrible things. So I get it. You know, there can be an argument made that 50 years later, the lady's 73 years old. She's not the same person she was at 19. And she's shown insight, remorse, favorable behavior, and all of that while incarcerated. I understand that. Mm-hmm. And but at the same time, yeah, if I were a family member, I would be very upset. And it's just an awful, awful case. And I just go back to the danger of cults and how we've all just got to never give up our ability to think critically and be very careful about the groups we get involved in.
And if you take the family members out of the equation here, they should be number one, obviously. But if you were to take that out of the equation, someone who was capable of doing this thing at 19, quite a crime. We can all remember being 19 as well. And I know I look at it from my perspective. I was not capable of doing that. I was also not under the care of Charles Manson at the time either. Right. So put that into the equation and, it starts to make you wonder what one is capable of doing. But the fact that it did occur, the fact that she did participate in a crime like that, is that something that she did her time, she spent it, she has been a model prisoner for the most part. Is this something that someone can really be rehabilitated from? I think anybody really fears that the 73-year-old is going to go and, do round two. But at the same point, crime was committed.
Right, right. Yeah, I would be fascinated to sit and talk with her and hear her version of her life and why she thinks she got involved in this group and how it impacted her thinking. To what extent was she under the influence of drugs? It's all relevant. And undoubtedly, we haven't gotten everything that there is to know about her and this journey. I think on a personal level, I would rather see her remain in prison, just life in prison. But it also makes me think of, going back to the 60s when these crimes happened. The 60s were a crazy time. And I was a little kid. I was alive then. I was little.
Yeah.
But I remember there were so many atrocities that happened during the Vietnam War where soldiers, just razed villages of innocent people and committed awful, violent atrocities. And in that way, we were able to understand that when people were in this awful setting, in this different situation, they did awful things that were out of the norm of their typical behavior. And so I'm not saying that that's a perfect analogy here, but it would be interesting to explore more with her. What world was she living in 50 years ago that caused her or allowed her to think that this was a rational way to behave? Because certainly from the view now, it's really hard to make sense of. And yes, I think life in prison, may she die behind bars. I don't think any of us would really quibble with that.
No, I don't think so. But is that something that we should look at closer as a society when convicting people or when looking at their sentence or their level of remorse for a crime, is trying to understand better what put them in that place? Why were they acting the way they were? Because once the actions occur, they occur. You took somebody's life. But understanding the group think, the cult way of thinking that she was under at that time, would that go further? And at the end of the day, does it matter when we consider letting someone out? If they can, does it matter what they were thinking at the time? I guess is the question.
Yeah, I think, coming from the psychology angle, it always matters. Now, that doesn't mean that they get out of prison just because we understand the reasons for it.
Sure.
But when it comes to any kind of penalty for even a minor crime, the state of mind and the circumstances have some relevancy, and in other words, the one that we run into so often is, was a person psychotic? Were they having a symptom that truly rendered them out of reality, so they did not understand that what they were doing was wrong? And of course, most of the time, that's not the case, but sometimes it is the case. And that makes a big difference, because when that brain illness is treated, they are not going to be violent people again, and there are lots of people who have committed crimes under some kind of altered brain state that are perfectly safe to be out. And so these are not even always violent crimes, but it can be, property crimes or assault or whatever, not necessarily where someone's been murdered. But I do think that the condition of the person at the time of committing the crime is relevant, although that does not necessarily mean that this means they get off with no penalty.
Sure. Relevant in terms of understanding the case, but not necessarily in the penalty area of it.
Exactly. And it may have something to, some relevancy with the penalty, that somebody who was truly in an altered state of consciousness didn't know what they were doing and would never have committed the crime. I think that that's very different from someone who's psychopathic and just is out to commit some kind of sadistic act.
You're locked into the Hidden Killers podcast.
Want more? Start binging on all of our true crime podcasts right now through Apple Podcasts, and get an ad-free experience when you sign up to be a True Crime Today Premium Plus member, exclusively on Apple Podcasts.
More of the Hidden Killers podcast, dropping soon.
Press subscribe now.